Good morning, my name is Gray Ellis and I'd like to welcome you to the Antonio Santaella Cigar Factory. This particular building was built in 1904. It was his third factory on this same spot. The first two burned down. So when he built this one, he bought the entire block and he built the factory in the middle with no neighbors on either side, and the back portion was given to the city for a fire station, which is still there. There's some pictures of Mr. Santaella on our wall here. He was a very wealthy Spaniard, knew how to make good cigars, all Havana Cuban tobacco, hand rolled, and Mr. Hamburger, who was his merchandiser, knew how to sell them. They were very successful. They had 3 factories in Tampa, 1 in St. Petersburg, and 1 in Key West. Let's walk out into the warehouse and I'll show you some features of the building. At one time, there was 1,000 people worked in this building. There's 4 floors counting the basement. They had to keep the tobacco cool, so their idea was to have the tobacco stored below ground where it was cooler. If you'll notice, the north side of this building, the windows are much wider than on the south side, which are more narrow. All of these factories were built the same way, running east to west. And the reason for that was to keep the sun always overhead and not shining in the windows. That was their way of helping to keep it cool. If you notice the floors, these are oak floors, but all the boards are very short, just about a foot. And they were all made out of scrap. These factories were built as cheaply as possible. This building has 52,000 square feet of floor space and was added onto several times over the years. We're walking back into the warehouse. Over here is where the freight elevator was added in the late 30s. We're going downstairs into the basement. It's a full basement. It runs the complete length and width of the building. Right now we're using it for storage, but there is something interesting over here I'd like to show you. This opening in the basement is where a small cart would roll on tracks into this cement enclosure, and they would roll the bales of tobacco into this room, seal it, and then put gas in there to kill any insects that might be mites or anything that might be on the tobacco. If a mite ate a hole through the leaf, it ruined the leaf, because when they roll it into a cigar, it would not draw correctly. Therefore, they had to be very careful to keep the tobacco leaf free of any bacteria. Over in this corner, There's a concrete tub that was filled with water from up above. They would spray the hands of tobacco to keep them moist, and if a tobacco dried out, it would become brittle and crumble. Therefore, they had to keep it moist, but yet not too moist, or the tobacco would begin to ferment. Well, both sides of the basement are exactly alike. There's another tub on the other side for keeping the tobacco moist. We'll go back upstairs. This is a slat conveyor that was used to bring the bales of tobacco down into the basement, where they would then be stored. We're walking back into the back of the warehouse, and I'll show you where the original dumbwaiter was in the building before they had the elevator. This is the original opening for the dumbwaiter, and once they had the electric elevator, they of course closed it off. But the mechanical parts for the dumbwaiter are still in the attic. They didn't bother to take them out. I'm going to show you now the rooms where the tobacco was stored later. They insulated these rooms to keep the temperature down, make it as cool as possible. And this was a bonded warehouse. Tobacco is heavily taxed by the government, and they're very careful to be sure that every bundle of tobacco is taxed. Therefore, once it was taken out of these rooms, the tax was paid immediately. They didn't wait till the cigars were made. The government got their money as soon as it was taken out of these rooms. The ceiling is still insulated. The insulation that was on these walls has been taken off, but you can see it was a fairly large storage area, and there was quite a bit of tobacco kept here till they were ready to roll the cigars. Mostly we have artists in the building today, and we have approximately between 30 and 40 artists that have studios here on the upper two floors. And we've had 2 artists die, not in the building, but that had studios here. And there has been reports that some of the tenants have seen them walking the halls, and so it's got quite a bit of character in this building. At one time, Babe Ruth would visit Tampa, and when he did, he always came to the Santaella factory to pick up his favorite cigar, which was the Optimo. That was the top of the line. And he was friendly with the manager and assistant manager, and they and another gentleman from Tampa would play golf together. They were a foursome, but he loved his Tampa cigars. These cigar workers were paid in cash. They originally came to the United States. They didn't speak English. They weren't familiar with the customs, and they would not accept paper money. because in Cuba they were used to receiving their pay in gold. So they figured out that they would take silver dollars. So that's the way they were paid on Fridays. The silver dollars were put in the envelope, kept in the safe, and they would close these doors, and they could look out through this glass to see who was ringing the bell to get entrance, and if they didn't like their looks, they wouldn't open the door. Let's go back in. I'm going to show you the safe that they kept the money in till they were ready to leave. This is the safe, and you can see there's another set of doors inside where the silver dollars in the envelopes were stored until it was time for them to be paid. Now, we've heard stories, and I'm assuming they're true, that the cigar workers here had to leave $1 under their mat at their table where they worked, which was a kickback to the manager. So they didn't have it very easy here. And if they didn't kick back their $1, not only would they lose their job, but any members of their family that also worked in the factory would lose theirs. So they were really coerced into paying that kickback. And there were a lot of children were employed here, and when the truant officer would come into the building to check, they would hide them in the restrooms till he had left. I'll show you some of the chairs that the rollers used. These were all built by the employee himself. Each one has its own character. These were found upstairs in the attic. We didn't even know there was an attic. And then we had a roofer go up there, and he said, "Did you know that there's furniture stored up here?" And this is what we found, were these broken chairs and these tables, which are called stripping tables. And they would strip the thick stem out of the center of the tobacco leaf, and they'd put the right side of the leaf on the right-hand side and the left side of the leaf on the left-hand side, because each side of the leaf is rolled differently in order to make it stay bound around the tobacco, the cigar. These chairs we thought were cowhide, but we found out that that's goat skin. The individual little cigar workers' house and backyard wasn't big enough for a cow, but it was big enough for them to raise a goat, which they would milk, and then they would slaughter and eat it, and of course they would tan the skin and use it for various purposes. I've got a little of the history of Mr. Hamburger, who was the merchandiser for Santaella cigars, and this is his picture. This is his, the census took of him, and he was from Germany, and I have a copy of his marriage license, and he was 26 and his bride was 19. They took a trip around the world by ship, and when they got back to the United States after the trip, he evidently had picked up some disease, and he died shortly after they got back. And his death certificate shows that he was 49 years old when he died, and they listed his cause of death as paralysis of the heart. But that's kind of sad. This is a picture of him and his wife and their little girl with some other friends, where they were on the ship going sailing around the world. We'll go upstairs and I'll show you some interesting things up there. This picture was given to me by my barber, and these are his grandparents, and they immigrated from Sicily, and she worked in the local cigar factories, and he was a dairy farmer. He had some cows, and he would personally deliver the milk himself. We can go upstairs. Arnold Martinez, who's a local artist, and he uses the extract of tobacco, in other words, tobacco juice, as his paint, and that's what this picture is painted with. We're on the second floor, and these have been subdivided into artist studios, and some of the artwork is still out on display from an art show that was here about a week ago. We can walk down the hall. All of these posts are wood that have petrified and are stronger than steel. I wanted to mention the lectors who were responsible for most of the news and education of the cigar workers. He was a very highly educated, talented person, and in the morning he would read the newspapers to the workers as they rolled their cigars. That's the way they got their news. He would read it in Spanish and Italian and English, and then in the afternoon he would read classics, and there were some hot arguments as to the subtleties and information that the classic writer was trying to get across. So they had a good time and enjoyed it. Besides, the average cigar worker made about $18 a week, and the lector made about $80. About to go into what we call our Churchill Gallery. The reason we call it that is because at one time a lady named Maria Castro worked here, and she was a very skilled roller of cigars and made cigars for Winston Churchill. She would roll them, they would be boxed and then sent to him in England. And we're very proud of her, and we're named the gallery, the Churchill Gallery, in her honor. This is the Churchill Gallery, and there are 7 studios all around that we have in this area, and we're very proud of it. We'll go up these back stairs up to the 3rd floor. This is a Civil War painting by one of our resident artists. And some of my children have posed for him. This character here is my son, Bubba. And I've got another son that's in here too, but I can't seem to find him right now. We have a lady who works here who's had several experiences with the apparitions or ghosts. I hope she's in this morning. I'd like for you to tell you about them. Hello.
Hi, dear.
We're here to ask you about your experiences.
Oh, hello.
This is Angela.
Hi, Angela.
Hi, nice to meet you. There were a couple of instances here. The first one, it's difficult to explain. You'd have to see the layout of the building. It doesn't translate well in just words, but early one morning, I was down on the other end of our office, and I was the only one here. It was about 7:30, and as you see, the floor is wood. So I heard someone walking in, assuming it was another coworker, and I go, "Good morning." No answer, and I keep doing my thing, and I heard the microwave door open, and I go, "Good morning." Still no answer, so I finally decided I should get up and go say hello. And I walked back here. It was sort of in the middle of the office at the time, and there was no one there, and all the office doors had been locked. And I was like, okay, that's a little weird. As I turned to go back to my desk, you could feel a person walking next to you on the wood floor. You know how it sinks down? There was a vibration, and something that I could not see was right next to me. So at the time, I immediately grabbed my cigarettes and my lighter and walked downstairs, called every employee and asked them how far away they were, because I wasn't coming back up here alone. The other time I was here with a friend of mine. It was towards the end of the day, about 4:30ish, and I was on that side of the desk. You see the railing, the divider, and she was standing approximately this side of the desk, and we're having a conversation, getting ready to end the day. And as we're talking, a man walks through the desk and down the hall between us. Just a figure of a man. You could make out the features. You could make out it was a guy. You could see his clothes. She looked at me. I looked at her. We locked up and went home for the day. So that was probably the most vivid and interesting event that I've had to...
How about the dog?
Which one? Oh, I have a dog. Actually, I have two Great Danes. For some reason, and I don't know what, my dog will not come into this office. She will walk up, she will just look, and I don't care if you give her treats, I don't care if you bribe her, you could try and pick her up and carry her, she will not come past the second floor. So I'm not sure what that means, but she's a very sensitive dog towards things, so I'm assuming that she's just scared of something.
Another tenant who had seen some sort of vision and thought it might be Tomas, you know, the old man that died.
I remember Tomas.
And the way the person described the ghost, he said, no, it's not Tomas, it's Boris. You remember Boris, the Russian?
No, he must have been before my time.
No, he was...
I don't remember.
He was here, Boris. He was the one who was he was from Kiev in Ukraine.
Across the hall, down the way?
Yeah, he was down in on the second floor.
I didn't know his name.
Yeah, well, he was there at Chernobyl when the explosion, meltdown of the nuclear plant. And he was making movies, and they were using helicopters, and they came in and confiscated all the helicopters and took them and were flying over the top, you know, filming and trying to drop dirt and water and everything. And of course, he immigrated over here, and he was a designer, designed all the costumes, designed the sets, and he was important over there. Of course, he got over here, and nobody even talked to him. And of course, his wife, who was a research chemist, was the breadwinner in the family. And of course, he was trying to build up his reputation here. He did a lot of type of paintings that you see in Russian Orthodox churches. He did a lot of that.
I remember the one of the Mary, the Virgin Mary,
Yeah.
that was up for a while. I remember that one. That was pretty.
Very nice guy, very talented.
Yeah.
One thing of interest, you might notice all the lintels in the building are wood, which is a no-no today. But the wood's so old that it's petrified, so it's strong. The interesting part about these buildings, most of them were made by Italian bricklayers that were imported to the United States for just this purpose. The walls are 16 inches thick with solid bricks, and the reason for that was to hold the heat out in the summertime and the heat in the wintertime. So that was their way of trying to keep these buildings cool or warm for the cigar workers. This is a typical cigar mold used by the cigar workers. They would form the filler tobacco into the shape of a cigar, push them down into the mold, clamp the mold together, and keep it clamped and tight for about half hour to 40 minutes. And then when they took it out, it would keep its shape, and then they would roll the outside leaf around the filler. But this is what they used to make the shape of the cigar, and they came in various sizes and shapes. If you look real closely under the porte-cochere, that dark thing parked under there is a Model T. This picture was made in the 20s, early 20s. Very successful. They had 3 factories in Tampa, 1 in St. Petersburg, and 1 in Key West. Let's walk out into the warehouse and I'll show you some features of the building. At one time, there was 1,000 people worked in this building. There's 4 floors counting the basement. They had to keep the tobacco cool, so their idea was to have the tobacco stored below ground, where it was a factory in the middle with no neighbors on either side, and the back portion was given to the city for a fire station, which is still there. There's some pictures of Mr. Santaella on our wall here. He was a very wealthy Spaniard, knew how to make good cigars, all Havana Cuban tobacco, hand rolled, and Mr. Hamburger, who was his merchandiser, knew how to sell them. They were very Good morning, my name is Gray Ellis, and I'd like to welcome you to the Antonio Santaella Cigar Factory. This particular building was built in 1904. It was his 3rd factory on this same spot. The first 2 burned down. So when he built this one, he bought the entire block and he built the cooler. If you'll notice, the north side of this building, the windows are much wider than on the south side, which are more narrow. All of these factories were built the same way, running east to west. And the reason for that was to keep the sun always overhead and not shining in the windows. That was their way of helping to keep it cool. If you notice the floors, these are oak floors, but all the boards are very short, just about a foot, and they were all made out of scrap. These factories were built as cheaply as possible. This building has 52,000 square feet of floor space and was added onto several times over the years. We're walking back into the warehouse.